In a world that rewards constant communication, incessant sharing, and performative transparency, we've forgotten one of the most powerful tools in human interactions: strategic silence. While everyone else is busy announcing their intentions, broadcasting their thoughts, and revealing their strategies, the truly effective operator knows when to shut up and uses that silence as a weapon. Niccolò Machiavelli, the 16th century Florentine philosopher and political theorist, understood this principle better than most. Though famous for his explicit advice in The Prince, Machiavelli's most potent insights often concern what should remain unsaid. The vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, he wrote, recognizing that speech creates appearances, while silence preserves reality. In an age of oversharing, those who master strategic silence don't just protect their position. They achieve what constant communicators cannot. They win while others are still talking about winning. The cost of unnecessary speech. Machiavelli lived in an era of political intrigue where careless words could lead to exile or execution. But even in our less legal modern context, unnecessary speech creates vulnerabilities that silence avoids. Men in general judge more by the eyes than by the hands. Machiavelli observed, "For everyone can see, but few can feel." The person who speaks constantly offers everyone opportunities to see and judge while revealing little about what can actually be felt or known. Every word you utter carries costs that silence doesn't. First, speech creates commitments. When you declare intentions, you wind yourself to them in others' eyes. Change course and you appear inconsistent or dishonest. Remain silent about your plans and you maintain the freedom to adapt without explanation or apology. Second, speech exposes your thinking process and limitations. The more you explain, the more you reveal about how your mind works. Information others can use to predict, manipulate, or counter you. As Machiavelli noted, the first method for estimating the intelligence of a ruler is to look at the men he has around him. Similarly, the first method for estimating someone's strategic capacity is to listen to how much they unnecessarily reveal. Third, and perhaps most importantly, compulsive speech diminishes your mystique and authority. It is far safer to be feared than loved. Machiavelli famously wrote, "Fear requires distance, and distance requires some degree of mystery." The leader who explains every decision, justifies every action, and shares every thought becomes ordinary, and the ordinary cannot command the same respect as the extraordinary. Consider how this plays out in modern contexts. The courting speaks in every meeting, weighed on every issue, regardless of expertise, gradually loses impact. The friend who shares every detail of their life on social media becomes predictable rather than interesting. The negotiator who fills uncomfortable silences with concessions gives away leverage. The leader who responds to every criticism legitimizes the critics while diminishing their own stature. Machiavelli would view our modern compulsion toward transparency and communication not as authenticity, but as strategic malpractice. A voluntary surrender of power that provides others information without securing equivalent value in return. The three types of strategic silence. Machiavellian silence isn't simply the absence of speech. It's a deliberate communicative strategy that takes different forms depending on the objective. Understanding these distinct types of silence reveals how this approach operates in practice. The first type is information gathering silence. The wise man does at once what the fool does finally. Machiavelli wrote, "The fool speaks immediately, revealing their position while learning nothing about others. The wise person remains silent initially, allowing others to expose their thoughts, intentions, and weaknesses before deciding how to respond. This approach creates asymmetric information advantage. While others reveal their thinking, you collect valuable intelligence without reciprocating. In negotiations, this manifests as the powerful principle that whoever speaks first loses. In relationship, it explains why the person who listens more than they speak often understands the dynamics better than the constant talker. In competitions, it's why those who announce their strategies before executing them typically underperform relative to their capabilities. The second type is authority-building silence. Machiavelli understood that power depends partly on perception. Perception can be enhanced through calculated reticence. A prince must imitate the fox and the lion, for the lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. He wrote, "Part of the fox's cunning is knowing when speech diminishes rather than enhances authority." Authority building seems naturally fill information gaps with assumptions that often favor the silent parties. When a leader speaks selectively, addressing only significant issues rather than every minor concern, their words carry greater weight. When someone responds to criticism only when truly necessary, rather than defensively answering every charge, they project confidence rather than insecurity. This explains why the most powerful figures in any domain typically speak less, but more deliberately than those beneath them. The nervous chew your executive overtalks. The CEO makes brief, decisive statements. The insecure person explains at length. The secure person states without justification. The anxious leader responds to every provocation. The confident leader selectively engages only when strategically valuable. Want to understand more about using strategic silence to your advantage? Hit subscribe now. The third type is ambiguity-preserving silence. Since it is difficult to join them together, it is safer to be feared than to be loved when one of the two must be lacking. Machiavelli advised. This famous observation acts beyond fear and love to all situations where maintaining multiple interpretations serves strategic interests. Ambiguity-preserving silence allows others to project their own hopes, fears, and interpretations onto your position. By refusing to clarify, you can simultaneously appeal to different constituencies with contradictory expectations. You maintain freedom of action by not committing to specific interpretations. You preserve deniability by not explicitly endorsing any particular understanding. Politicians master this by making statements vague enough that different audiences hear what they want to hear. Effective negotiators use it by avoiding clear positions that would prematurely narrow potential agreements. Leaders employ it by articulating vision without unnecessarily constraining implementation details. In each case, strategic silence isn't deception. It's the recognition that premature clarity often undermines rather than advances objectives. As Machiavelli observed, politics have no relation to morals. In his view, effective strategy requires maintaining flexibility that excessive communication would compromise. The psychological power of silence. Beyond its tactical advantages, Machiavellian silence exerts powerful psychological effects that speech cannot achieve. Understanding these effects explains why silence often succeeds where persuasion fails. First, silence creates projection spaces. Human minds instinctively fill informational voids, often in ways that reflect their own preoccupations rather than reality. When you remain silent at key moments, others project their fears, hopes, or assumptions onto that silence, revealing their position while you maintain yours. As Machiavelli noted, men are so simple and so much inclined to obey immediate needs that a deceiver will never lack victims for his deceptions. The strategic use of silence leverages this tendency without requiring active deception. This explains why skilled interrogators use silence rather than questions to elicit information from reluctant subjects. The discomfort of silence compels the subject to fill the void, often revealing more than direct questioning would. The same dynamic operates in negotiations where the side that tolerates silence typically secures better terms than that nervously fills pauses with concessions. Second, silence establishes dominance in communication dynamics. The person who speaks first frequently or at greatest length subtly positions themselves as seeking approval or validation from listeners. The person who speaks less, more selectively, or only after others have committed to positions implicitly claims the judge's role rather than the supplicant's. Machiavelli would recognize this as an expression of his principle that it is better to be feared than loved. The silent party is not necessarily loved, but their restraint often commands a respect that valuability cannot. This dynamic explains why job candidates who ask more questions often perform better than those who talk more about themselves. It explains why the quiet person in meetings often receives more serious consideration than vocal participants. It explains why respectful silence in conflicts often is more effective than passionate argument. In each case, silence shifts the power dynamic by inverting the typical pattern of seeking approval through speech. Third, silence creates mystique that amplifies perceived power. As Machiavelli observed, men judge generally more by eye than by the hand because it belongs to everybody to see, to few to feel. What cannot be fully seen or understood often appears more formidable than what is completely exposed. The person who reveals everything, their thinking, motives, insecurities, plans, becomes ordinary. The person who reveals selectively retains an element of mystery that magnifies their perceived capabilities. Consider how this operates in leadership contexts. The leader who explains every aspect of their thinking demystifies their role and invites others to see themselves as equally capable. The leader who shares conclusions while keeping deliberative processes private maintains a mystique that reinforces authority. This isn't about deception, but about understanding that leadership partially depends on others' perception of capability that exceeds their own. The dangerous allure of transparency. Modern culture often treats transparency as an unqualified virtue and silence as suspicious. Just be authentic, we're told. Share your truth. Communicate openly. Yet, this advice, while well-intentioned, contradicts Machiavelli's strategic insights about power and influence. The promise given was a necessity of the past. The word broken is a necessity of the present. Machiavelli wrote, recognizing that binding oneself to past declarations often undermines present interests. The modern fetishization of transparency demands precisely this kind of binding, a voluntary constraint on future action in service of present authenticity. This isn't to advocate dishonesty. Machiavelli's approach wasn't about lying, but about selective disclosures, sharing what advances objectives while withholding what doesn't. Never attempt to win by force what can be won by deception, he advised. In contemporary terms, this might translate to never attempt to win by unnecessary disclosure what can be won by strategic silence. The transparency trap manifests in multiple contexts. In professional settings, it appears as the impulse to share works in progress before they're ready for evaluation, to voice half-formed opinions in meetings, or to reveal negotiating positions before understanding the other side's constraints. In personal relationships, it emerges premature emotional disclosure, unnecessary confession of past errors, or detailed sharing of future plans still subject to change. Machiavelli would view these behaviors not as authenticity, but as strategic mistakes that surrender power without securing commensurate benefits. The transparent person becomes predictable, manipulable, and ordinary, qualities that undermine rather than enhance influence. This perspective challenges contemporary communication norms that equate volume with value and disclosure with authenticity. The Machiavellian communicator speaks not to express themselves, but to advance specific objectives. They withhold not to deceive, but to preserve options. They maintain silence not from insecurity, from strategic discipline. Practical application, the discipline of silence. How might Machiavelli's strategy of silence apply in modern contexts? The application isn't about becoming completely taciturn, but about developing the discipline to speak only when speech serves your objectives better than silence. First, practice information asymmetry before sharing your position in any consequential matter. Ensure you understand others' positions first. Ask questions rather than making statements. Listen for what remains unsaid rather than responding only to what's explicitly stated. As Machiavelli advised, the lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps, and a lion to frighten wolves. The fox's cunning begins with gathering information while revealing littles. This approach proves particularly valuable in negotiations where understanding the other party's true constraints and priorities often matters more than articulating your own. It applies equally in workplace dynamics where knowing colleagues' concerns and motivations before committing to positions bears conflict and enables more effective influence. Second, cultivate strategic ambiguity when clarity would prematurely limit options. This doesn't mean being deliberately confusing, but maintaining flexibility by avoiding unnecessary specificity. A prince should therefore be very slow to believe and to act, nor should he himself show fear. Machiavelli counseled, this slowness to commit preserves freedom of action. In leadership contexts, this might mean articulating vision and objectives while leaving implementation details open for adaptation. In personal relationships, it could involve expressing commitment to shared goals while maintaining flexibility about specific paths. In competitive situations, it would mean keeping strategies private while opponents reveal theirs. Third, develop comfort with silence as a power position. Most people experience silence in conversation as uncomfortable and rush to fill it, often revealing more than intended or making unnecessary concessions. Training yourself to embrace these moments rather than filling them creates significant advantage. In negotiations, this manifests as allowing silence after stating your position rather than nervously qualifying or weakening it. In conflicts, it appears as listening completely to criticism before responding rather than interrupting with defenses. In leadership, it emerges as delivering decisions without unnecessary justification, trusting the decision to stand on its merits. The strategic whisper. Machiavelli's strategy of silence doesn't advocate never speaking. It advocates speaking only when speech serves your objectives better than silence. The master of this approach doesn't maintain complete secrecy, but creates a strategic contrast between what is revealed and what remains private. The vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, Machiavelli observed, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar. In a world where most people reveal everything, those who cultivate selective disclosure stand apart. Their words carry greater weight precisely because they're chosen more carefully. Their positions generate more interest because they're revealed more strategically. Their influence expands because it's exercised more judiciously. This approach requires discipline increasingly rare in contemporary culture. It demands the patience to listen before speaking, the restraint to withhold even when disclosure feels temporarily satisfying, and the strategic awareness to recognize when silence serves better than speech. These qualities don't develop naturally in a world that rewards constant expression, but they create advantages precisely because they're uncommon. The final irony of Machiavelli's strategy of silence is that its most successful practitioners remain largely unrecognized. We notice the loud, the expressive, the transparent, while the masters of strategic silence achieve their objectives without drawing attention to their methods. They shut up and win while others are still talking about winning. Perhaps this explains why Machiavelli himself, despite his enormous influence on political theory and strategy, remains widely misunderstood. His name has become synonymous with ruthless manipulations. Yet his insights reveal a deeper understanding of human psychology and power dynamics that transcends simple ruthlessness. He recognized that influence doesn't always require force or deception. Sometimes it requires simply knowing when to remain silent and let others reveal themselves. In an age of information overload, opinion saturation, and compulsive sharing, Machiavelli's strategy of silence offers a counterintuitive path to influence. Say less, observe more, reveal selectively, and let your results speak louder than your words in the endless competition for attention and power. Those who master this approach don't just participate, they prevail.